see that pop up on your screen right now. Um, so this session is sponsored by the Center for Community Media, which is housed at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. And today we are thrilled to have with us Dr. Amanda Wilkerson. She is, yes, please give a warm welcome in the chat. Let Dr. Wilkerson know how warm this space is. She is currently a professor at the University of Central Florida. Um, for all of you who know what's happening in the educational landscape in Florida, give her some love for the work that she continues to do. And and she does a lot of work around equity, both in the educational space, but this latest research project really focuses on what this looks like for young Black voters. And so her research really helps to open the exploration on how we should be talking to young Black voters, how their attitudes differ from some of the conventional wisdom that we've had historically about Black voters and young Black voters and what it takes to get their attention. So I think this is going to be a jam-packed, wonderful session. As Dr. Wilkerson is going through her presentation, if you have questions, you can feel free to add them in the chat. We will have time for Q&A at the end. And then, during that Q&A time, if you want to jump in, feel free to raise your hand and we'll be sure to get to those. So with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wilkerson to walk us through this presentation. Thank you again for being with us today.
So good afternoon, everyone. I really hope that you can hear me clearly. At least I'm seeing a green line around my box. So that's an indication to me that we're good to go. I will avoid reintroducing myself because I think that Cheryl did such a great job and really just giving you who I am and what I do and where I'm able to do it at. My hope for today's conversation, if I can be direct and honest with you, is to have a discussion that helps us understand who the other Black voter is. How did I come to this sort of research conundrum, if you will? And what does that mean in terms of their civic engagement and what I refer to as culturally relevant messaging? I also hope, because I wanted to pack so much into the presentation, and given the time that we have, I knew that I wouldn't be able to give you everything. So I hope that the information that I have hand selected for today's presentation in terms of presenting to this body of individuals will enable you to ask questions that can pull out more information from me. And in addition to that, my research team and we developed a one-pager to sort of buttress the information that you would hear as additional information at the end of the PowerPoint. I'm also giving you a QR code where you can have access to the full report about who the other Black voter is as we talk about unlocking the power of messaging and what it means to really appeal to young Black voters. So, as in terms of the objectives, I really want us to consider who we are thinking about when we think about voters. I want to be able to share with you some of the analysis and the examinations that we found in looking at the participants that were interviewed for this huge research study. And then I would like for us to think through some of the things that I present as a new and innovative way to really reimagine this idea of who the Black voter is. So I want to set the scene for you, if you will. In the midst of COVID-19, for me, before vaccinations were available, I really observed a phenomenon that was largely unexplained. My journey here at the University of Central Florida began in 2019. I'm on a tenure track position here, and by spring 2022, so just one semester in, everything changed. COVID-19 happened, it swept across the nation, and what that did for educators in particular is put us in this interesting position where we were having to really do our role in a reimagined way. We're at home. And it had me to shift and shape my focus in a different way in terms of how I would reach out to students. So initially, my research agenda was looking at the pedagogical approaches in post-secondary environments. In other words, how do instructors teach? What do they value? And how do they bring that learning to students? But then something caught my attention while I was at home. I remember people were turning out to protest before there was ever a vaccine, wearing masks, going out to really protest against, and I want to take my time and say this, against the systematic racism that we saw in police profiling, which was sparked by the death of George Floyd. And I used that opportunity as a moment of reflection because I started to think about who is the American voter. So I like to do this exercise. When I say the word American voter, what image comes to mind for you? So you can keep that thought with you, but I want you to think about this. Now, based on that image, when I say Black voter, what image comes to mind for you? And was there a difference between the image that came up for American voter and Black voter? And finally, when I say Black youth voter, what image comes to mind? The reason why I'm asking you to do a lot of reflection is because when we think about the profound question of who the American voter is, I found out a couple of different things. First, some people think about the pageantry of the electoral system. They think about the speeches, the candidates, the voting booth, but they don't come up with an image of an individual. Then when I'm more specific about who I want you to picture, the images that normally come up, people talk about are civil rights, especially when I say Black voter. And then when I say Black youth voter, people don't even say, at least those that I interviewed and those that participated in this study, they don't even mention themselves or maybe those around them. They may talk about Black youth voters within the context of a historical sense, like a John Lewis or a Martin Luther King. Why is this important? Well, this led me to ask, or it really inspired me, I should say, to ask questions that I think would not only define who the Black voter is, right? But also thinking about who the Black youth voter is. I started reading the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, where he gave a speech about the other America. In this work, he really wanted to frame that there was an America that we know, and there's certainly an America that we do not know. And in that same sort of framing, I thought about the dialogic sort of connections between the voters that we know and the voters that we don't know. And this is how I came up with the concept of what is the other Black voter. It is a critique, I think, of understanding equality and justice when it comes to voting and figuring out what picture comes to mind for us, but it's also an emphasis on thinking about what we understand and trying to understand that in a historical sense and within the modernity of where we are at now. So just a little bit of background because I'm a researcher and I want you to know that there was a full study done on this. In 2022, I received grant money from the National Science Foundation to look at culturally relevant messaging and the political socialization of students, Black students who attend historically Black colleges and universities. We got about 118 participants between the ages of 18 and 29 to participate in this study, as long as they self-identified as either Black or African American, and they attended and were currently enrolled at an HBCU and were between the ages of 18 and 29, which is the ages of what we consider to be youth voters, then they were eligible to be a part of this study. One of the things, or a couple of things that we found right off the bat, were that they had key concerns about their behaviors when it came to voting. The thing that I want us to consider, though, is if you've never heard the word political socialization, what it actually means is the development of beliefs and values. And oftentimes, am I stuck?
Your image is stuck, but we hear you.
Okay, so I'm gonna continue going, but I apologize about that. So oftentimes, what happens is that we will have we'll have an idea of how people vote and turn out, but we don't know what's motivating them in terms of their values. And so this is where I came up with this idea of understanding voters through a constricted and expansive view. First of all, a constricted view of the participants that we were looking at would assume that they have low civic engagement, that they're not interested in being involved civically, or that they don't have an idea about how to participate. And what we found out in a more expansive way is that they are indeed engaged in wanting to be involved civically, but what drives them and motivates their civic engagement has a lot to do with social and political change that matters to them. Another constricted view of Black youth voters is that they are low or single issue voters, meaning they only have one thing they want to focus on, or that they don't vote at all. When in fact, we found that there were a diversity of perspectives and priorities that mattered to them, ranging primarily from experiences that they have had that motivate them to think about the world around them and what resources they can use to change them. And then finally, a constricted view of Black youth voters is that they are a homogeneous voting bloc, that they all vote the same, and they all have the same inclinations around voting. When in actuality, they're more of a heterogeneous voting bloc, meaning depending on where they are geographically located, their level of education, level of income, there are going to be things that matter to them that they're going to take a stand on. And so what was revealed to us is that there's an understanding of Black youth voters, but we've been stuck in a rut, if you will. We assess over turnout numbers and how many people have voted instead of exploring the why behind their choices. And oftentimes, this sort of narrow focus on voting as the sole measure of political engagement ignores this rich tapestry of experiences, this rich tapestry of motivations within this diverse group of voters. And what we tried to do was figure out what their voting inclinations were and how we would understand them through definition. So my research sort of unveils the voting perceptions that are often sort of drowned out in mainstream narratives. We moved beyond like simply acknowledging that there are constrained views of them as well as expanded views of Black youth voters to offering a framework for understanding the diverse motivations and I would say the messaging approaches for their voter inclinations. I want to unpack that a little bit because instead of calling them an accommodationist, the activist, and the advocate as an individual, what we're really describing is their inclination as it pertains to their voting behavior. So an accommodationist is really a voter who seeks to work within the existing system in an acritical manner. You tell them to go out and vote, they go out and vote, and it's emphasizing sort of this gradual induction, if you will, into voting. Yet one of the drawbacks of it is there's a high risk of complacency and slow progress because they're just accommodating the demands, the wishes of someone outside of them, and they're not connecting their involvement to what they are valuing. The power of this particular voter inclination, though, is that there is an ability to influence and navigate within the traditional structure if you think about socialization, which is development, a focus on development. So you can't graduate out of being an accommodationist when it comes to a voter inclination, but you can be socialized out of it. The next inclination is an activist. And this is basically a driven desire, if you will, to be immediately involved in taking some form of action when it comes to an issue or a concern that is important to this particular eligible voter. It highlights an urgency that they see things around them that is important, that moves them, and they might act. But one of the drawbacks is that, one, their potential action does not amount to voting. It could be that they might vote or they might do some other form of action. It's about action, but not necessarily about voting. And what energizes them is the opportunity to change. And then finally, you have the advocate. And this is an inclination where there's a balance between change, stability, seeking long-term and sustainable progress, but also centering one's values and beliefs politically first, then figuring out approaches where they can use civic engagement resources to be politically engaged. Now, I wouldn't say that this is the pinnacle of the inclination, but this is just what we found as patterns in the population that we looked at. Why does any of this matter? Because oftentimes there are messages like somebody fought for your right to vote. Go out and vote. It's important that you vote. But this messaging doesn't fit the inclinations of the individual. It's either very transactional in nature, whereas asking the individual to do something in an acritical manner, right? Or it is very transactional in nature, translational, excuse me, in nature, where we try to figure out what they want, but not really talk to them. When essentially what we're trying to and sort of support is transformative messaging that supports political engagement over the long haul. So the thing that I think is important about empowering the future when it comes to political socialization is that we've inherited this legacy of getting out the vote as a message that's rooted in the struggle for like basic voting rights. But today's Black voters are very different. They didn't have to fight for the right to vote. It's their birthright. And telling them to vote simply because they can rings hollow. So a part of the research that we did reveals that the political landscape that they're in right now fails to reflect their realities. They're not apathetic, they're just dissatisfied. And essentially one of the biggest findings that we found for this study is that while Black youth voters have evolved, the messaging tactics and the organizing tactics have not. So the problem is that they don't want to vote, or they aren't interested in voting. It's still that we're using messages from 1965, if you will, to turn out the vote. So imagine if you're fighting for a right to vote in 1964 and 65, then it's important to say, go and vote. But if you have the privilege to vote like my generation did, then you understand that right. But if you have a prerogative, it ends up being really an outdated way of getting involvement. And the other thing is that 1/5 of all African-American voters are what we call the new generation of Black youth voters. And those who fought for their right, individuals like my mother, they are seeing the sunset of their life, right? And so this ends up being sort of a way to think about how this evolution is really important, because if we don't understand who the Black voter is, and we don't change Black youth voter is, and we don't change our messaging tactics for them, then essentially what we're going to find is that there's going to be less engagement. But it's not because they don't want to vote, it's because we don't understand them as voters. So what is the way forward? I didn't really want to leave this conversation without providing some recommendations. And I also have, again, created a one-pager just for this group so you all can have access to it because there was a lot. We did this study over 2 years to unpack, and I was trying to find the most impactful and powerful information to share with this group to help you understand that we really have to change messaging tactics. But I think the way that we can solve this problem is that we have to understand and engage with voters with messaging that doesn't resonate only around voting. The other example that I like to use quite often is after we tell youth voters to vote, what is the message for youth voters when it comes to preserving Social Security, for example? If you don't know it, then it's not out there. What is the message for supporting youth voters and understanding issues around retirement, issues around home ownership, issues around health care? This is just not about identifying a problem about messaging regarding voting. And the problem is we only look at this during an election season, but it's about forging ahead and thinking about ways in which we can take action that reframes messaging for this population in a way where we go deeper and we think about impact above and beyond just the voting apparatus. So my framework for a path forward is before we take action, we have to understand the voter. And I would suggest that what we understand about them has a lot to do with turnout and has very little to do with socialization. And then we have to figure out what the blueprint for action is. Is it that we are trying to ensure that they understand issues, but haven't talked to them to figure out what it is they know and don't know? Oftentimes, what ends up happening is that research is done on them, not with them. And so we concoct an idea about what is needed from them or about them without really actually knowing. And I think the uniqueness about this is that when we work with them, we can understand their motivations a little bit more. And then finally, I think we have to think about the possibilities, that this is just the front line when it comes to understanding where we can take this research in terms of Black youth voters and political socialization and culturally relevant messaging. This happens when we move, I think, beyond the generic appeals and really embrace this idea of what is culturally relevant messaging. One of the things that the participants said to me that I thought was important is don't tell me you got hot sauce in your purse, or I don't want you to be relatable. I want you to be reliable. These are things that the voters were saying or the participants were saying that really helped me reimagine that our engagement with them has to be about having an empowered view about who they are and not leading with the activity we want, which is the vote most times, but leading with having them understand what values are important to them and how they can center that. I want to again thank you all for participating. I hope that my camera will work because this feels odd, but I have a lot of again information. I hope that this just piqued your interest because I think the kind of questions you ask will help me really unpack for you the significance and the importance of the insight of this work. So Cheryl, I'm going to turn it back over to you and figure out how I can fix my camera.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was, I think there's a lot of provocative information for us to delve into more in our conversation. So I'm going to give you a second while you're trying to work through the camera. Um, I, when Dr. Wilkerson and I had our initial conversation, one of the points she brought up in her presentation that really spoke to me or really stood out to me um, was this idea about um, the fact that political socialization has not been studied in Black folks since they were getting the right to vote. Yes, we see you also. Um, so, oh wait, you're frozen again. Okay, give it a second. Um, so we really are using the same playbook from that socialization from the 60s. And so This research really gives a lot of insight into what this, can look like for a new generation for all of the things that Dr. Wilkerson brought up. So I want to open it up for questions. If you want, you can raise your hand or put something in the chat. I'm going to start with Josie. I see you said you have a question or comment.
Sorry, I'm driving and trying to manage the phone. This is absolutely terrific. Thank you so much, Cheryl, and thank you so much to the researcher. So I have a query, and before I pose the query, I'm going to just preface this by saying that I launched a newsroom not as a journalist, but rather to use journalism as a tool of civics, and also as to use journalism as a tool of political radicalization, for want of a better word. And so for the past 2 years, we've run a community journalism class. And this year sort of brought home a few things that we were seeing in our newsroom. And so we have 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds, those in their 20s. We saw there are two sets of young people. One who are writers, and then those that are activists. Those that are writers are really intrigued by journalism as a tool. Those that are activists are really having a difficult time seeing journalism as a tool of transformation. And so the activists are sort of resistant to journalism. The writers need and desperately need political education. So we're seeing like how do you manage this when our newsroom is the center of the activist voice, which is to provide the activists a framework and tools to sort of engage in activism, engaged in how you're transforming public policy, how are you deepening your understanding or taking your political education into the streets. And then for the writers, sort of engaging in political activism for the first time, because our writers must go onto the streets, must go to political meetings, must read. So political education is a part of how we teach journalism. So we're seeing that, which is sort of in the way in which you've sort of characterized the different segments in your pool. I find that fascinating. So I'd love to read your research and see what we're seeing in this very, very tiny, tiny, tiny small pool, right? So we're not talking a whole bunch of folks, we're talking maybe 50 people at the most.
Right.
The other piece is, and this is the other piece, how many of your surveys are of Black youth who identify as immigrants,
identify
as first generation, right? Because I'm an immigrant, and so I come into the political process very differently. So when I say we're using journalism as a tool to radicalize, I'm not using journalism or political education to get people into the polls. I'm trying to get them to understand the systemic issues. They get to choose whether or not they vote. We are committed to being we are committed to being uncommitted. We're committed to expanding. We had a town hall where we had a member of the Green Party in a discussion around the rise of Kamala Harris, right? So there's a member of the Green Party, there was a member of a former member of the Black Panther Party. So having those discussions here's sort of a backdrop and context to understanding the duopoly in America. So for me as an immigrant, I come to the political process quite differently. We do have young immigrant writers, and so their understanding of the world also plays into the mix in our newsroom on what rises to the top, or how are they interpreting politics and political education, and how does all of this become a tool? So I just wanted to sort of share that. I think your research is spot on, and I can't wait to read it. So thank you.
Yeah, Thank you. So one thing that I want to talk about is that in research, what we do is we use models that are already in place, particularly when we are doing surveys, because they've been verified, if you will, to a certain extent. We use those that have already been created to ask them. So basically, we took a survey that was sent out to respondents that was done by major political organizations. Pew is an example of that. And I want to directly respond to your question about asking about a person's status. When we look at the diaspora, it's a very sort of one-dimensional way of understanding African Americans. Is either Black or African American. And when we gave them the survey, they only could pick African American, white, whatever the case may be, because that is what traditionally is used as a standard for people to identify what their race and ethnicity is. The reason why I love focus groups over surveys, and if you talk to anybody that does political persuasion, they're going to tell you you find more information from doing focus groups, is because it was during focus groups that we found that people felt that the surveys didn't quite cover who they are as individuals. And it came up when we started asking about issues, and they would say, well, I'm from South Florida, and my father is Haitian, but he doesn't have all of the documentation needed. And I get concerned that because he's driving around, that somebody might stop him. And I thought to myself, man, we have to go back and really unpack what it meant for somebody, a Black student we were talking to who's from the Midwest, to talk about their experiences as having Gretchen Whitmer as their governor versus Ron DeSantis as their governor as a student in Florida, and what it meant for someone who is of Haitian, Jamaican, Bahamian descent to talk about their political involvement when their parents weren't as politically involved in this system in the country. Now, the reason why I'm saying that, and I'll be brief because I see other hands, is because I don't yet think we have the tools to capture that information, and it didn't come out until we started doing the focus groups, that we were ill prepared to look at these participants beyond a binary way of seeing their race through a color and not a culture. Because they may identify as Black, but they were proud to be Haitian, Jamaican, whatever the case may be. The other thing he said, I do think we have to shift our obligation and alignment when you start talking about those who use writing as activism, and how there might be some dissonance between activism and their political positionality. We have to move the obligation for alignment, because these voters don't see the alignment or don't value the alignment. And I think it might be very critical to judge that they don't want it to be aligned. What if it was okay that there was no alignment? I mean, we don't make rules for certain presidential candidates that are already running, and they aren't aligned to doing a lot of things that are going to directly impact the lives of everyday Americans. And yet we require Black youth voters to, be interested in voting, though the issues never really reach them, especially when we think about the vehicles in terms of messaging that are used to go out to them. These particular voters are going to have to experience something that connects them, drives their motivation, and then they are going to align it for themselves. But we can't do the alignment for them. And that's the story we have to start writing, that there is really no alignment. And what does that mean? How do we explain it? And why is that important?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're saying that. Yeah, thank you so much. Hence why we focus on political education and context. And not sort of what's a trajectory to the polls. So understanding context is so critical. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We have a ton of questions. So I'm going to go back and forth between the chat and the hands raised. So this question is from, or this question was sent directly to me, so I won't say the name. Are there or should there be differences between the messages for men and women based on what you saw in your study?
Yeah, so definitely messaging must evolve. I think that the days of cookie cutter appeals around messaging, they're certainly over. I think there's space to consider, should it be differences between gender, race, ethnicity, age, income, all of those different variables, right? But that's a demand we have to make to people who are messaging to us, because in all actuality, it does not happen. One of the most corrosive things that I think occurs, particularly within the African American diaspora regarding messaging, is that they go to the church, they tell everybody to go to souls to the poll and go out and vote. And they don't consider, one, that there are a plethora of different sort of, I would call, political actions and actors within our community. And that if you want to get out someone who is not necessarily involved in church, especially after COVID, let's really think about that. A lot of people are still utilizing social media, Zooms and Facebook and YouTube to access church. And then they're not even going on Sundays. They may decide to pick up the broadcast on another day. And so to that point about, should it be looked at based on gender? Absolutely. I think that the thing that I want to sort of lay down and buttress is that we have to move beyond that you can only message to Black people in one way. And we have to give account for the many differences that we have within our diaspora. So certainly that will be a part of the variables that I think should be included when we think about new messaging techniques.
Thank you for that. I want to hand it over to Dev Allen to ask his question, or their question,
Sure.
I should say.
Hey you all, hey Dr. Amanda Wilkerson.
Hi.
I was, and this might have been clarified in some of the answers, but I was very curious about the inclinations between, the activist, the accommodationist, advocate. I was wondering if you could expound more on the advocate one, and if that's one to, because you said it's a balance of both, and I wonder if, is that a sweet spot? Is that one we should try and bring more people into, or are these just simply, different totems to work with and to appeal to, essentially?
Yeah, so part of the writing that I'm doing now is looking at, should we even put this on the spectrum, accommodationalist, activist, or advocate, or are these inclinations that happen based on how people are engaged? Like, is this a momentary thing where maybe at some point in your life, you're going to be an accommodationalist, or at some point in your political or civic engagement life, you may be an activist. In other words, you may not be in one of those inclinations for the rest of your life. And that's what I'm leaning on, based on the research that I conducted. I would tell you that the phrasing that I used was not to use alliterations of A, right? It was to really take into consideration the work of Carter G. Woodson when he talked about Booker T. Washington and the accommodationalist mindset that a prominent African-American leader had in terms of accommodating the interest of the powers that be. I think in the same way, when we treat Black youth voters in an acritical manner, they just start to accommodate the interests of the status quo instead of centering their beliefs, their values. And again, what we want them to do is to be socialized to consider what their values are, because when that occurs, then I can't guarantee that there's going to be continued civic and political engagement, but I can assure you that someone who is accommodating you today may not feel like accommodating you tomorrow. And that's a dangerous trajectory to be on when we think about the need, particularly in the African-American community, to use voting as a tactic, a tool, a vehicle to ensure that there is some levity when it comes to equity regarding policy in this country.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wilkerson. Next is from Najla, who asks, does this research have aligned insights into voters from other backgrounds, and how to best increase voting and civic engagement across communities in the U.S.? Are there parallels outside of the U.S. in research, et cetera?
Man, I wish I had a lot of money to do it, but I'm going to be honest with you, there is. So if you go to Tufts University, they are researching on youth voters. If you go to Harvard University, they are researching on youth voters. Civic Nation, they're researching on youth voters. Campus Center for American Progress, they're researching on youth voters. But with youth voters, they weren't focusing on my population, and that's African American youth voters, which is why this became very important to me. You know, Cheryl talked about what our introductory conversation was about when we talked about or imagined having this discussion today. And one of the things that struck me as odd is that in 1967, the last empirical work on the socialization of Black youth voters was done, meaning they stopped thinking about what we valued. And a lot of work now just focuses on what do you do to turn out voters. That happened right after African Americans got the right to vote in 1964 and 65. So to respond to your question, one of the things that I think is very important is to help people understand that it's not a turnout game when we're talking about African American voters, period, and certainly not with Black youth voters. And while tons of research has been done on what do you do to support educated voters, non-educated voters, female voters, it always has this sort of one-line note. And it's based on white voters. And so this work reintroduces the idea that one, should we be asking this question about African American voters? And two, if we are, let's ask the voters that are going to be more likely to be engaged. And also, I think that there is a floating question out there about really understanding the mystique and magic that happens at historically Black colleges and universities that allow these students to enter to learn, but depart, in the words of Dr. Mary McCall Bethune, with some sort of service to their community. There are more African Americans who graduate from HBCUs that serve in the Congress, more African Americans that graduate from HBCUs that are mayors, city commissioners, county commissioners, and yet we don't have any evidential information to indicate why. So this is why I'm starting this research, and I hope that it can be my research agenda for the rest of my academic life, and that I can encourage others to think about research questions around this topic, because I don't think we're asking the right questions right now.
Thank you for that. And I saw Nejla in the comments was also thanking you for that answer. Let's go to Cynthia.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Horner, the publisher of Right On Magazine, which is an entertainment magazine that became popular in the 70s and it's now digital. I'm also a poll worker, and I noticed that when I have been working the polls for the past several years, a lot of times we see young people standing around the poll site, looking for information, trying to figure out how the voting process works and that kind of thing. And I noticed that most people do not really embrace these young people that are coming in to take a peek to see how this process works. So I always leave my station when I'm a poll worker to try to encourage them to come in, take a look at the voting booths if they have not voted, give them information on how they can register to vote, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems like it's still kind of like a secret. It's almost like no one really wants to embrace these younger people and get them involved, even let them know that there's money available to become a poll worker or get involved with these local elections. Now, how can you, this question is directed toward Dr. Amanda. How do you respond to that? Because I'm doing what I can do as a journalist and a poll worker, but what can other people do to try to encourage younger people to get involved in the political process and give them the knowledge and tools so that they can be more informed about how these processes work?
So Cynthia, I appreciate that question, and I hope that you take my comment with a grain of salt, because I'm gonna be a bit terse. But I think that engagement with youth voters can't just be about a campaign tactic and voting. It has to be an ongoing dialogue, because if we're going to center them being engaged for reasons that support them wanting to see change, then that development is going to occur before elections, while elections are occurring, and even after. Some of the things that I see that are occurring right now when it comes to youth voter engagement really is about not necessarily persuading them, if you will, but is it coming from a trusted voice? And what are your reasons for really wanting me to use my vote? You can't use my vote and ignore my voice when I am saying to you, okay, I'll vote for you today. And prime example would be Cardi B, and I got to slow down because all this wants to pour out of me. Where she was really excited during the last election season, right, about being involved in the political process. Then she started seeing what was going on in New York City about what wasn't being done or how things weren't being managed and got turned off. And so she came out and declared, hey, I'm not voting. I ain't supporting anybody. I'm not, I'm not going to say get behind an individual. And that is because there is a lot of distrust between you taking an individual's vote, but not carrying the power of that vote and making change on behalf of them. And so don't use our body and not worry about our brains. These are what you voters are saying about. I tend to be more pragmatic. I'm imagining that I will vote for you today. You may not get to my issue today or tomorrow, but somehow in the by and by that you'll get there. I'm 43. That works for me. That's not going to work for my 18-year-old, 19-year-old nephew. He's actually 19, who he wants to know why I got to vote. None of them are going to do anything for me. And so if we start with voting as a tactic, we're already missing out because the focus has to be on development and engagement beyond that.
Thank you for that. I want to go to this question in the chat from Clyde Hughes. Should there be messages for all three sets of young voters that you described? And what
Oh,
are
yeah.
some of those messages that you think would be effective in engaging young people? Maybe this is a little bit framed differently based on your last response. This is about voting. So,
No, that's okay. Because I'm gonna keep hammering home that it should be about development. Stacey Abrams talks about voting. That's her lane, registering to vote. Latasha Brown talks about organizing and engagement. And I'm going to be talking about culturally relevant messaging because I think it's critical. And I think that development has to occur from the minute that they get an opportunity to understand what it means to be civically engaged, because the research indicates that there are different forms of civic engagement. Now, let's go back to the question. Are there different messaging tactics? Yes. For an accommodationalist, the messaging focus is really on the person that is requiring them to accommodate a request. It's saying to that person, what are your reasons for engaging this individual? If it's only about having them accommodate your request, then we have to change your positionality about how you get them to be involved because you're hurting us long term. So the focus there is on the individual who is doing the messaging, the messenger, if you will, and not the messagee. When it comes to the activists, it's about using that translational knowledge, that translational messaging, and trying to ensure that we are understanding them in a transformative way. What do I mean by that? We'll look at how they're acting, never talk to them to get their perceptions directly from them, understand their lived experience. Just look at their actions and try to make meaning of those actions without having a solid conversation. When I tell you that research hasn't been done on this population about political socialization and messaging, it's not just to herald that I'm the first one. It is to say it is a shame that every 2 years, every 4 years, we're having a conversation about voting, right? But we don't know how to talk to a population of people that we're asking to vote. And so the way you message to the activist voters is you remind them that your activity is important. Here are other ways for which you can be involved, and you allow them to choose. You don't make the decision for them because the power is in allowing them to know that they have the ability, but you're not trying to force them and pushing them back into or pushing the messaging back into an accommodationalist form. And then finally, you have transformative, and it's just reminding them to rethink their inclinations, to always make sure they're centering their values and beliefs. And even if we disagree, with those values and beliefs, allowing them to own it, because over time that is going to situate a more informed voter than trying to get them to accommodate our request to vote, or only looking at the activists and trying to translate how can I use their activity so that they can vote. In fact, I go into more detail in the 2-pager that I believe Cheryl is going to give you all, not because I think that that solves the problem, but it does answer the question about what are the different messaging responses for an accommodationalist, for the activists and the advocate voting inclinations.
Yes, so just so you all know, there is a 2-pager that I will be sending along with the recording in the next few days, which will include these 3 voters and specific messaging strategies for each community that needs to be reached. Because as you can hear, based on their motivations being different, the messaging needs to be tweaked for each audience as well. Will, I'm going to turn it over to you. Will, are you there? Will Brown?
All right.
There
Dr.
we go.
Wilkerson, Dr. Wilkerson. Good afternoon, Dr. Wilkerson.
Well,
Hi. So great to be with you. So the one thing I'm curious about is it was mentioned time and time again that, so often I fairly took that to assume mainstream media, but people in general obsess over turnout, but we don't always ask why. How would you suggest that more people, whether journalists or political scientists or others, can really find out the why of voters in rapidly? What are ways that you would suggest that people can find out the whys of voters, and in large enough numbers that they can be synthesized and analyzed, or at least come to some type of conclusion?
I think that there has to be a real fascination with the truth, and there has to be a real investment in this particular population where they are privileged about the information just as much as those who are looking to run for office and get their votes. One of the most fascinating thing that's occurring right now for me, Will and I went to Florida A&M University, so it really is indeed an honor and he's an esteemed journalist out of Jacksonville. So Will, thank you so much for participating in this conversation. I hope that I'm giving you something you can work with. But one of the things that I think is a preoccupation with the media with regard to Kamala Harris right now is Black Greek letter organizations and support for her. I think what is being missed is the bigger picture, because it's not about why this organization or these organizations are influential. I think their power and impact is actually undeniable, and it's been like that for years. I grew up in a city where when my parents were going out to vote, and they would take my sisters and I with them, we would see AKA Zetas, Deltas, Omega Psi Phi Alphas out there working the polls, getting engaged, trying to support candidates at the local level. So that's not new to my eye. The real question that I think that mainstream media is overlooking with regard to this whole Black Greek letter organization as a pillar of civic engagement is that it's not a new phenomenon. It's really a symptom of, I think, a persistent habit of viewing Black voters and their support through a narrow one-dimensional manner, because you don't know enough about the community. And so you see this as new, and now you're laser focused on what is being done and not why. So to answer your question, Will, I tend to really feel like we have to go back to maybe some larger ways of framing the conversation around this, which is, what are our reasons for wanting to talk to these voters? Like, are we there to really understand them? Are we there to get a quick soundbite about who they're voting for, post the story, and move on? That takes investment, maybe that folks don't want to initially investing over time, but you get a better story when you understand the voter and you're thinking about them within the context of which I'm asking people to reframe the conversation in, which is development, values, beliefs, and not just necessarily outcomes. And by that, voter outcomes.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wilkerson. I have a question in the chat from Sharon Broussard. Talking to my nieces and nephews, your findings ring so true. Is there any candidate talking to young people or any recommendations of that you would point to as examples? And then if you were advising candidates, what should they do?
Yeah, very good question. We asked our participants to tell us in focus groups which candidate appealed to them more. So let me go back to who our participants were. 18 to 29-year-olds. We interviewed them on their campus at their HBCU, right? 18 to 29-year-olds, African Americans, and they attended a HBCU. They said AOC, I'm not making this up. They said Bernie Sanders. And then when my research team and I were just like glued in, like, oh my God, they didn't name anybody African American. They didn't name anybody that was in their state. You know, we started pointing out, you know, subliminally, we're looking at each other. And then finally someone said, oh, Michelle Obama. They didn't even say Barack Obama, and he was a former president. So how do we make meaning of that? They need trusted voices. And these trusted voices for them meant that these individuals, or what I would say political actors, were sharing information with them that got them excited in some way. Or it could be the exact opposite, that we were asking participants and they just told us who the main people were, but we didn't ask during an election year. So that cut that out. There wasn't like a lot of commercial and television about it. And two, when we asked them, it wasn't as though we pushed them in telling us who it should be. Now, the reason why this is important is because it doesn't have to be a rapper that appeals to these Black voters, because again, they also said, like, don't tell me hot sauce is in your purse. Don't try to relate to me, right, without being reliable. So this is again why I keep pointing to this sort of important indicator is, can we trust you to do what you're saying you're going to do? Can we trust you to tell a story about us that is really about our lived experiences? Or are you just going to report on what Sexy Red has said about supporting Trump, but not talk to the voter who is more likely to vote, who has some form of a post-secondary education, that is thinking about these nuances, but isn't putting it in this sort of win or loss column, this or that column? It's many shades of gray. And what makes the difference is, can they trust you? Their engagement is not up for sale, but their development is there, so that their socialization is there so it can be developed.
Thank you for that. I know we have 2 minutes left. I'm glad you left plenty of time for questions, Dr. Wilkerson. Josie, I know your hand is back up. If you have just a quick question or comment, because I want to make sure we close.
Yeah, so I actually think that you kind of answered it, right? So I was curious about your pool, your sample pool, and it's HBCU, because I was wondering, are you controlling for class? And
No, they came from all economic backgrounds.
Yeah.
The only thing that we controlled for is we wanted all of the participants to self-identify as either African American or Black. And the primary reason for that is because we know that the problem of practice is that these are unheard voices when we talk about youth voters. Go back to the example that I started with when I asked you to, you know, imagine what an American voter is. What picture came to mind? Now I say Black voter. What picture came to mind? If you didn't look, if that picture didn't look like my participants, then this research is for you. And the fact of the matter is, this is why we conducted the research and got funding for it, because there is no empirical evidence, only anecdotal evidence about who Black youth voters are.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more, because I'm wondering what happens to the those who are not at HBCUs, right, which is the overwhelming majority of Black people, 18 to 29, they're attending community colleges. So, you know, maybe yeah, we can talk more about that, because I'm more interested in what's actually happening to those young people on community college campuses who are experiencing so many repercussions of public policy and ways to engage them, not just in a classic political process, but also in radicalization. But thank you so much.
Oh, Josie, let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yes. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Wilkerson, for doing this research, helping to push this conversation forward and giving us so much to think about. You could tell we were a very engaged group and had a lot of questions, and I know there's going to be a lot of follow-up. As a reminder, everyone, I will be sharing the recording and the resources that Dr. Wilkerson brought up, the 2-pager slides, etc. I'll also include, if it's okay with Dr. Wilkerson, her email address, so that you all can continue the conversation if there are things you want to continue to discuss. So thank you all so much for taking the time to chat with us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.